Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and good evening to anyone who's listening from Israel. We in Israel have completed our fast, but we're still in the throes of Eikha and having experienced this really, I think, very powerful day. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the bigger questions in Eikha. Eikha, of course, the book of Lamentations, is the book that deals with the national trauma that is in place as a result of the Churban, as a result of the destruction of Yerushalayim, of the temple, as a result of the exile of the Judean community in 586 BCE. But really, I think that the book, it lacks any dates, it lacks any specific people. It's a general description of trauma. And as a general description of trauma, it's a very useful book for trying to understand how we as religious people, and particularly I think also as a religious community, are meant to experience trauma. Now, I'm not actually for the moment addressing the psychological question. I'm today going to be addressing, there have been articles that have been written about how we can read the book from a psychological perspective, but I'm interested, I think, really in what the Tanakh is particularly interested in, which is the theology, right? What is the, how do we understand the theological presentation of Megillat Eikha? Certainly what we know is that these events breed terrible theological confusion. The question as to how we relate to God, how we understand God's role, why God did what he did now, and what that demands from us in our relationship following this event. And how we can reconcile with this event as a community. Now, we know that the Churban, that these events of the destruction breed these theological questions, and primarily not from Eikha, primarily from several chapters in the book of Tehillim, which are actually describing the events of the Churban, such as the destruction of the Mikdash. This chapter in Tehillim 74, in chapter 74, has at the in Pasuk Zayin, the part that I highlighted here in yellow, Shilchu va'esh mikdashecha. Right? This is a description of how they burned your temple with fire, and this is followed with a poignant question that is directed to God. Ad matai Elohim yecharef tsar yinaetz oyev shimcha lanetzach, which generally sort of can be translated, how long will the enemy continue to shame Israel and profane your name, God? Right? So the Churban, the destruction of the Mikdash, it produces some very poignant questions, some very strong questions which are directed at God. In the very next verse, we again have a question which is directed towards God. Lama tashiva yadcha viminecha. Why, God, are you restraining your hand? Which basically is a question to God. Why, God, do you remain passive even in the face of these terrible events? These are important questions. These are theological questions. We're asking questions about God, about his willingness to help Am Yisrael, about his willingness to go out and protect his good name, and also to protect the name of Am Yisrael. This takes place in several different places in the book of Tehillim. So, for example, in chapter 79, which also the parts that I've brought for you here in yellow, which I won't be reading, are a description of the destruction of Yerushalayim and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, which produces once again these very direct questions, which I've highlighted for you here in blue. Adma Hashem te'enaf lanetzach. Will you remain angry, God, for eternity? Is there an end to this terrible situation that we find ourselves in? These are the sorts of questions that I think we should expect in Eikha. Now, I'm saying that because we're not going to find it in Eikha. So I'm starting with what I do expect to find and what we find in other places. Really, the events of the destruction of Yerushalayim, the destruction of the temple, these are unprecedented events. The destruction of the Davidic dynasty, the cessation of Israel's autonomy, which they've had in place for approximately 500 years. These are terrible, catastrophic events, and they should really breed these theological questions. I'll bring you one more Mizmor Tehillim, where again, what the context seems to be this exact catastrophe, this exact time period. Here, this Mizmor, which I've only brought a small part of it, this is our second longest chapter in the book of Tehillim, and that is chapter 89. The context of this chapter is the loss of the Davidic dynasty, and particularly the loss of God's promises that the Davidic dynasty would be an eternal kingship, right? And so at the end of this chapter, the chapter in Pasuk Mem Zayin, in verse 47, the question which is sort of flung at God is, Adma Hashem tisater lanetzach. Again, will you, God, remain angry for eternity? And then a really rather presumptuous, almost chutzpahdik question, Ayeh chasadecha harishonim Adonai. I'm reading what I colored here in blue. Where, God, are all of your promises of loyalty? So we're not lacking in questions here, right? And we're not lacking in boldness in addressing God with some of these questions. I mean, these are questions that we find all over the Tanakh. Sometimes they're extremely chutzpahdik, some of these questions which are flung at God. Specifically, actually, in this chapter in Tehillim, the Ibn Ezra at the introduction of the chapter says, "Well, I knew a very pious and wise man in Spain who refused to say this chapter because he thought it was rather blasphemous in its questioning of God." So we know how to ask questions. We know how to ask theological questions. We even know how to express a certain amount of anger at God. What I really want to begin by saying is that Eikha doesn't really ask these questions. Eikha doesn't really deal with theology in a direct way. Eikha is a book of trauma. It's a book of catastrophe. It does have some rather brief sections of grappling with theology, one of which we are going to talk about in our class today, which occurs really just at the core of the book of Eikha. In the middle of chapter 3, we have 19 sentences that grapple with theology, that grapple with God's ways. And then at the conclusion to the book, at the end of chapter 5, we have another 2 sentences that grapple, obviously grapple may be a little bit of a strong word, but that somehow seem to address the theological issues. But mostly, Eikha is not a book of theology. It is a book of trauma. It's a book that is describing the terrible events. It's a book of emotions. It's a book of pathos, right? It's a very powerful book, but it's not Eov-like. It's not necessarily a book which is dealing in this systematic way with the questions that arise at God's ways as a result of the terrible events. That having been said, I still think that if you look properly at Eikha, you have to see the theology. You can't miss the theology, because this is a biblical book, right? And even when the book is describing the events, and I don't understand. Perhaps maybe we can mute everyone. Okay, thank you very much. I think that if you look properly at the book of Eikha, you're going to see the theology of the book really emerge from where it seems to be hiding. And I think that the way we can see it best is if we look at the structure of Eikha. So we know structure and technique often reveals meaning. And that this is certainly true in Eikha. If you look at the overall structure of the book of Eikha, it's built as a chiasm. Now, a chiasm is an ABCCBA structure. Perhaps the best example of a chiastic structure in the Tanakh is this verse that I brought for you from the 9th chapter of the book of Bereshit. It's after Noach comes out of the ark and God says to him, Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. I'm not going to get into that right now. All I really want you to see is that these chiastic structures exist in Tanakh, A, B, C, C, B, A. Now, the book of Eikha actually has an odd number of chapters, and therefore I would maintain that Eikha is not a chiastic book, but it's a chiastic concentric book. In other words, we have a middle chapter that has no corresponding chapter. And obviously that already indicates to us that there is something very unique and very important about that middle chapter, which we are going to get to. And I think we all recognize that that chapter is meant to be unique, because anyone who glances at the book already sees that that chapter contains a triple acrostic, which means that it has triple the amount of verses. It's a very different sort of chapter in that it describes the experiences of an individual, and it's not exactly a lamentation. If chapters 1, 2, and 4 all open with the word Eikha, which is some kind of, word that opens a lamentation, well, chapter 3 opens with the word Ani hagever. I am the man. So I do want to eventually get to that middle chapter and see if we can understand more deeply the theology of Eikha by looking more closely at that chapter. But before we get there, I don't want to skip what I think is swirling around this chapter, what is the theology that is swirling around this chapter. And what you have in a chiastic structure is you have the correspondence between chapters 1 and 5, and another correspondence between chapters 2 and 4. Okay, so chapters 1 and 5, I'm going to claim that these chapters are very, very similar chapters in terms of their language, in terms of their themes, and most important of all, in terms of their theology. So let's begin with trying to understand what is common to chapters 1 and 5, just to establish that this chiastic structure really exists, because the purpose, I think, of observing this chiastic structure is to see that it has a theological message. So let's look at what chapters 1 and 5 seem to have in common. They describe the suffering of the entire nation. They don't focus on the children. They don't focus on the kings. They don't focus on the religious leadership. That we're going to see in chapters 2 and 4. Chapters 1 and 5 are focused on everybody: the women, the children, the men, the young, the old. That's the description in these chapters. And they're very quiet chapters. Even though what we're describing is a catastrophic destruction of Yerushalayim, these chapters are not actually describing the destruction. For that, you'll have to wait for chapters 2 and 4, where you will see the actual dismantling of the city, the burning of the buildings. Chapters 1 and 5 tell us about the eerie loneliness of Yerushalayim in the aftermath of the destruction. Eikha yashva vadad ha'ir rabati am. How does the city sit lonely, that city that was once so filled with people? Chapters 1 and 5 are stories of the quiet of Yerushalayim that has been emptied out of its inhabitants. And only in both of these chapters do we have a description of widows, right? That's how we open the book, with a metaphor that the city is like a widow. And also in chapter 5, we have the word widows. Imotenu ke'almanot, our mothers have become widows. We have a description of the emptiness of the city that is very much emphasized by a key word which appears in both of these chapters. I've brought it for you here in chapter 5, and that is the word ein. There are none. That word we have several times in chapter 5, and we have it also 5 times in chapter 1. In other words, the chapters are not about the destruction that is taking place in Jerusalem, but rather what is not in Jerusalem. Jerusalem has been emptied of its consolation. It's been emptied of its population. It's been emptied of its buildings. It's been emptied of its holiness, of its dignity. The description of these chapters are really remarkably similar in terms of the tone, in terms of the theme, and also, as I said, linguistically. Both of these chapters describe the tears of Jerusalem. Bacho tivke valayla v'dimata al lechia. She surely cries in the night, and her tears are left on her cheeks. Why are her tears left on her cheeks? Because there's no one in the city to wipe them away. The city has been emptied of its populace. But also, if you look at what I've just brought up on the screen, in chapter 1, we have the words, Al ele ani vochia. It is about these things that I am crying. And we have a remarkably similar verse in Eikha, parak 5, Al ele chashechu einenu. About these things, my eyes have been darkened, right? So we have these description of tears, or of the darkening of the eyes as a result of the tears in both of these chapters. We have the chapters are describing desolation, and both of these chapters have this phrase, libi davai, my heart is miserable, which I put here in green. I tried to make it easy by color coding everything. But what I really want you to see is that these two chapters share certain language, certain themes, a very distinctive tone. I'm going to show you now a chart comparing chapters 1 and 5. It's a very complex chart, but I just want to give you a sense of how much linguistic correlation actually exists between these two chapters. We're not going to dwell on this chart for long, but I just want you to see it, right? So I've color coordinated it just so you could see what's going on here. These chapters are not incredibly long, but they share a tremendous amount of similar language. We're going to see the same thing with chapters 2 and 4. This is the way that the Tanakh tells us that these two chapters really are meant to be corresponding chapters. I'll get to the theology in a few minutes. I now want to just show you the similarities between chapters 2 and 4. They're similar in terms of their language. They're similar in terms of their themes. Again, we're going to see that leads us to see their similarity in terms of the theology of these two chapters. So if you look at the tone of chapters 2 and 4, and I kind of alluded to it before, these are very loud chapters. They're describing the destruction of Yerushalayim, the physical dismantling of Yerushalayim, the terrible famine in the city, and its really horrific consequences. We have, as I said, these are very loud chapters. These chapters are filled with God's anger, with God's punishment. The chapters describe a terrible fire that is going to consume Yerushalayim. In Perek Bet, we have the phrase, Shafach ka'esh chamato. He poured out his wrath like fire. And in chapter 4, we have Shafach charon apo. He poured out his anger. Both of these phrases are talking about God. Actually, that word shafach appears 7 times in the book of Eikha. All of them are in chapters 2 and 4. Again, corroborating this similarity between these chapters, we have in both of these chapters a particular description of the death of children, a very horrific description of children dying on the streets of the city because of the terrible famine. The words olel vionek, right? Very young children, suckling children, appear in both of these chapters. The terrible brokenness of the people appears in the phrase that I highlighted in green, al shever bat ami, the brokenness of my people. And of course, these two chapters have the distinct dishonor of having the most horrific description in the book, maybe one of the most horrific descriptions in all of Tanakh, and that is the description of the mothers who, as a result of the horror of the famine, eat their children. We have that both in chapter 2 and in chapter 4. So chapters 2 and 4 are really very similar chapters. Again, I've prepared for you a very similar kind of chart that I showed you for chapters 1 and 5. I'm not going to keep it for a long time on the screen. I just want you to get a little bit of a sense of it and to see really what the Tanakh has done here in terms of the language. It's really, I think, very unusual what we're looking at here in terms of the chart. This is a very strong correlation from a semantic perspective, from a linguistic perspective between these two chapters. So what is going on in these two chapters? What is it that we're meant to be understanding about the similarities between these chapters? Well, what I really think that this similarity, this correspondence is pointing us to is that these chapters seem to have kind of circles of theological approach. Chapters 1 and 5. What is the theological approach of chapters 1 and 5? So I'll say something about chapter 1. Chapter 1 actually is divided into two parts. The first part of chapter 1 in Eikha is the third person objective narrative. It is an outsider describing Yerushalayim's troubles. That's until verse 11. From the end of verse 11 on, Yerushalayim is speaking in the first person about herself. It's a really different description, and I'm not going to get into now why we have that change of speaker. But I will just say that at the beginning of the chapter, when the outside observer is describing Yerushalayim, the outside observer blames Yerushalayim. Hashem hoga al rov sha'eh. God made her moan because of her terrible sins. Chet chata'a Yerushalayim al kein lenida hayata. Yerushalayim surely sinned. Therefore, she was punished in this way. Therefore, she had other people nodding their heads at her in empathy or in attempt to mock her. Right now, once Yerushalayim comes into the picture and begins to talk about herself. Re'eh Hashem et onyi. Look at my pain. Look at my affliction. Re'eh Hashem vehabida. Look at me, God. See what I have become. And when Yerushalayim describes her own pain, she says, look at what I've highlighted in yellow. Asher hoga Hashem biyom Charon apo. She disagrees with the narrator. The narrator said God made her moan because of her many sins. And Yerushalayim says, God made me moan because of it was the day of his anger. There's a certain kind of deflection of personal responsibility here. We see that Yerushalayim is working her way towards assumption of responsibility, towards a sense of acceptance of sinfulness, but she does eventually get there. By the end of Eikha Perek Aleph, Yerushalayim will say things like, Tzadiku Hashem, Kifiu Mariti, God is just. Indeed, I have disobeyed him. I have rebelled against him. Re'eh Hashem kitzarli ki maro mariti, for I have surely rebelled. Al kol psha'ai, because of all my transgressions. What we have in Eikha Perek Aleph is the theology of tziduk hadin. The theology of it takes a while. It's not a simple journey, but of eventually recognizing God's justice, right? There is a sense here that Yerushalayim kind of makes its way, it almost gropes its way towards assumption of responsibility. We have a very similar thing in chapter 5. Chapter 5 is a lot shorter, and therefore it's a much more stark picture. Chapter 5 is a third of the length of chapters 1, 2, and 3. It's a very, very brief chapter, and it tells the whole story of the losses of Jerusalem in almost a list-like way. I've lost this, and I've lost that, and I've lost that. But there are these two moments in chapter 5 where the the community engages in some kind of attempt to understand what is happening. The first place is in Pasuk Zayin, which I brought for you here. Avotenu chatu ve'enam. They say our fathers sinned and they're no longer. Va'anachnu avonotehem savanu. And we are suffering for their sins, which sounds very much like not assuming responsibility, not accepting responsibility for the sins. But if you look ahead towards the end of chapter 5, what do they say at the end of verse 16? Oy na lanu ki chatanu. Woe to us, for we have sinned. And so we have here a story which is common to both chapters 1 and 5. And the story is a story of reconciling with God's actions and regarding them as just, as fair recompense for Am Yisrael's sins. It is a story of reconciliation with the situation. It's a theology of tziduk hadin, of understanding that there is justice in what has taken place. That's the theology of chapters 1 and 5. And that's kind of what encases the book of Eikha. What is the theology of chapters 2 and 4? It's a really different sort of theology. We have here a lot of anger. There's a lot of descriptions of God's anger. There's a lot of descriptions of the death of young children. And if you look here at the very end of chapter 2, look at these last few verses that I brought for you. Look at what the Yerushalayim flings at God, starting in verse 20 in Pasuk Kaf. Re'ei Hashem v'habita. Look, God, and see. Lemi olal tako. To whom have you done this? Im tochalna nashim piryam olelei tipuchim. Women are eating their children, those who they nurtured and raised. Look at the very, very last verse that I brought for you here that I colored in yellow, where an accusation is flung at God. Haragta biyom apecha, tavachta lo chamalta. You killed on the day of your anger. You slaughtered without pity. This is a really different sort of chapter from a theological viewpoint. This chapter never reconciles with God. It is filled with God's anger. It is filled with confusion. It's filled with a lack of comprehension, and it's filled with situations which are really about the death of innocence. The death of children is a classic case of tzaddik varalo. Good people, innocent people who bad things happen to them. We have something very, very similar in chapter 4. It's not quite as direct as chapter 2. Chapter 2 is really filled with some very, very angry and statements by Yerushalayim, which are really kind of heavy and hard to understand how they could say this about God. Haragta biyom apecha tavachta. God, you slaughtered, you killed, you had no compassion. Right? We have something a little more muted, or a lot more muted in chapter 4, but chapter 4 as well seems to adopt a similar kind of confused attitude, certainly presenting the major victims in the chapter as the children who are dying from famine, the children who certainly do not deserve this, who certainly one can't say about them, well, I know you did this because of all of my sins, because of all of their sins, right? These chapters really never reconcile with God's actions. They remain confused and shocked by what they have seen. So these chapters are chapters which are really, I think, filled with difficult to understand. Now, what I want to kind of summarize before we go on to our middle chapter and trying to understand the kernel of this book is I want to give a little bit of a sense of what we've actually seen, right? Chapters 1 and 5 are the kind of periphery of Eikha, right? The periphery of Eikha is enveloped, it's kind of encased in this simple faith in God, what we would call emunah pshuta, this simple faith that if God did this, it must be right, it must be just, it must be good. Without this faith, the world, people can't exist in this world. Without this faith that God has justice, that God only acts with justice, the world would be dark, it would be absurd, it would be evil and incomprehensible. On the other hand, Eikha doesn't ignore the reality. It doesn't resort to some kind of easy answers in the face of these really difficult theological questions. Anyone who has lived in the world, or certainly anyone who has gone through times of great national trauma and seen the terrible tragedy and the terrible absurdities that accompany these events. And of course, we are still in the century of the Holocaust, right? There's not, we're certainly a nation that understands the enormity of tragedy that strikes both good people and bad people without discriminating between them. Certainly understands that you can't just say so simply, everything works, everything makes sense, whatever God does is good. And so we recognize, or Eikha recognizes, in this middle concentric circle, that not everything can be explained, that there are things in our relationship with God that leave us shaking, that leave us without understanding. And so I think that the first thing that we can say about the structure of Megillat Eikha is that it shows us how complex this grappling of human beings with God in the book of Eikha is. 1 minute, a human might be able to say, Sadiq hu Hashem kifihu mariti. God is just, for I have rebelled against him. And in the next minute, we hurl our anger and our bewilderment towards the heavens. Re'eh Hashem v'habita, look God and see. Lemi olal tako, to whom did you do this? What have you done, God? Eikha, I think, presents the way that human beings, that religious human beings, encounter tragedy while attempting to preserve our relationship with God, but also to preserve our own intellectual honesty, our own encounter with the very difficult reality of what it means to be human. So we experience both a simple, pure faith in God, and at the same time, an unremitting outrage over some of the incomprehensible things that we have to contend with as humans in this world. And now I want to turn our attention to chapter 3, which is the heart of the chapter. Oh, here I brought a little bit of a summary. Chapters 1 and 2, Tziduk Hadin, the attempt to justify God's theodicy, and chapters 2 and 4, Sadiq Varalo, innocent people who suffer bad things. And now I want to turn our attention to chapter 3, which I've already noted is a chapter that wants to draw our attention. It certainly is attention grabbing, both in terms of its structure and in terms of its placement, and also in terms of some of the anomalies that attend this chapter, right? This is a chapter that right away, the minute that we look at it, we immediately see this is a very different sort of chapter, right? I mentioned already it's triple acrostic, the fact that it opens with a different word, a word that immediately focuses us on the gever, the individual, ani hagever. We have not yet seen an individual. Jerusalem spoke in the first person singular, but of course, Jerusalem is a city. She represents the collective nation. She is not an individual. Here we have the story of the individual. Now, obviously, chapter 3 is a very long chapter, and I'm not going to have time in the 20 minutes left to me to properly examine this chapter. But I will say a couple general things about the chapter. The chapter divides into 3 pretty equal parts. In the first part of the chapter, the Gever describes his suffering. In the third part of the chapter, this man again describes his suffering. So suffering is surrounding the middle of the chapter. The the reality around this Gever doesn't actually change. He changes very much because the middle chapter are his theological reflections. Okay, let's look a little bit at the Gever's suffering. His suffering begins with the word Ani hagever ra'a oni b'shevet evrato. I am the Gever, I am the man who has seen my affliction at the rod of his anger. Who is he? Whose anger is causing him to beat him mercilessly with this rod? Rashi says very, very succinctly, that's God, right? The hidden he in all of these verses is a description of God who is mercilessly battering this poor Gever. Now, the Gever goes on to describe his suffering. We won't read it all. I'll just note that he describes his suffering in darkness. Those are the words that I highlighted in blue. He's very much focused on himself. It's a very narcissistic kind of description, which I think maybe is kind of natural for someone who is suffering terribly. Those are the words that I highlighted in yellow: ani, oti, bi, alai. He's very much focused on himself. And his sense is that his suffering is endless. There is no way out. And one of the ways that he conveys this is that he is being encircled from all sides. Those are the words that I brought for you in green. Yahafoch yado kol hayom. God's hand is encircling me all day. Vayakaf rosh utla'ah. He is encircling me with poison and hardship. Look at these psukim. We have the Gimel psukim, right? You see how the first three verses are Aleph, 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 and then the next three are Bet, Bet, Bet. Well, look at these Gimel psukim. Usually, when you have this triple acrostic, there are variations on the word. But if you look at the Gimel psukim, the first one of the Gimel psukim starts with the word Gadar Ba'adi. He built a fence around me. Again, there's that sense of encircling. In the third Gimel pasuk, he again says Gadar Dirachai. He surrounded my paths. And what do we have directly in the middle? Directly in the middle, we have the words Gam ki ezak va'ashaveh satam tfilati. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is blocked. First of all, note that he never talks about God in that pasuk. Usually prayer has an I-thou component. But part of the story of this Gever is that he sees inward. He can only focus on himself. And what is he describing here? He is describing his sense that he is surrounded by some kind of fence and nothing can get out, not even his prayers. His prayers are completely stuck inside of this fence, along with him and all of his woes, all of his troubles. I will just look at one more pasuk of this really terrible description of the Gever's suffering, and that is pasuk Yud Dov Orev Huli Ari B'mistarin. This is, I brought for you a rather frightening picture here. Well, it's a pretty frightening description. He is a bear lying in ambush for me, a lion in hiding. Who is the he that he is describing? Rashi says once again, it's God. This Gever is describing God as a wild animal who attacks, of course, without any rational reason, without any discrimination between people. This seems to be this part of chapter 3, when the Gever describes his suffering. It seems very similar to what we saw in chapter 2, which is suffering at the hands of God that makes no sense, that has nothing to relieve it. That's the description in the first section of chapter 3. And so it shouldn't surprise us that this section ends with the following words: Vatiznach mishalom nafshi, nashiti tova, My soul rejected peace. I forgot what was good. Va'omar, and I said, Avad nitzchi v'tochalti meHashem. I have lost my strength and I have lost my hope in God. So pretty much what we see here, I think, is the Gever who has just been, struck from every direction, who feels that he has no way out, who feels that he has become the object of irrational torment. And what he says is, I have no more peace, I have no more good, I have no more strength, and I have no more hope. And so we kind of have a sense of this Gever lying prone on the floor, unable to get the strength to go on. And at this moment, though, something I think pretty remarkable happens, which is a little hard to explain. The only explanation I'm going to give for the moment is that something happens in verse 18 that has not yet happened in the chapter, and that is he says God's name. Va'omar avad nitzchi v'tochalti meHashem. Until now, he has been speaking about God is in the hidden person. Shevet Evrato, Dov Orev Huli. He is his rod, but he never actually mentioned God. The minute that he mentions God, things begin to shift. And we suddenly see him starting to have memories. Zachor Yumerudila Navarosh, Zachor Tiskor. You see that threefold Zachor there? He's beginning to think. He's beginning to think about his past. He's beginning to think about his relationship with God. It's somewhat elliptical. In other words, we don't really get the full picture of every aspect of the inner movement of the Gever, but what we do see here is an 180-degree turn. All of a sudden, the Gever, this tormented individual that had lost all of his hope and all of his peace and all of his good and all of his strength, suddenly he starts thinking about God. Zot ashiv el libi, this I will think about. I'll put it in my heart. Al ken ochil, therefore I will have hope. Look at the next phrase that I highlighted in yellow. Al ken ochil lo, then I will have hope in him. It's good to have hope in silence. Suddenly we have almost this snowball effect of this Gever who is reacquiring his hope. And what is giving him that ability to reacquire hope? It's when he begins to ponder God's ways, when he begins to think deeply about God. And what does he remember about God? Chastei Hashem. I'm reading in verse 22 in Pasuk Kafbet, what I highlighted here in blue. Chastei Hashem ki lo tamnu, ki lo chalu rachamav. What is he remembering about God? Chesed and rachamim, loyalty and compassion. He's remembering God's goodness to the world, and this is giving him the strength to remember more, and then to have more strength, and then to remember more. And so very rapidly, this story moves in a very different direction. In fact, if you look at the theological reflections that we have here, right in the center of the book, these 19 sentences, which is really a very brief theological grappling, it's divided into three parts. The first part is when he thinks about the ways of God. The third part is also him thinking about the ways of God. And what do we have in the middle of the middle of the middle? Okay, we'll see that in a moment, right? That's the very, very core of the book. It's the kernel of Megillat Eikha. It's going to be something, I think, really significant for understanding the theology of the book. But in the meantime, let's look for a moment back here at this first section. Well, we already saw it. I don't think we have to dwell on it. I brought it for you here in English. This I call to mind, therefore I have hope. The kindness of God, his mercies are not spent. His loyalty, therefore I hope in him. It's good to hope in silence. These are his reflections on God's ways. Now, if you look at the third section of his theological reflections, again, we're going to see that he's thinking about God's ways and what words seem to kind of predominate here. Rachamim and chesed, kindness or loyalty and compassion. Okay, so that's what's surrounding the middle. Now let's look at what we have in the middle. The middle, I'm calling it the suffering Gever finds good. Now, I've brought for you this picture of Starry Night. It's also the picture that I put on the cover of my book on Eikha. Probably the most frequently asked question since my book came out is, why do you have Starry Night on the cover of your book? So I'll answer it right now. I think this is a picture of Eikha. Eikha is a storm. Chapters 1 and 5, chapters 2 and 4, the first section and the third section of the story of the Gever. It's stormy and it's turbulent. What happens at the eye of the storm? That's where human beings find their inner strength. That's where human beings find the resilience and the resources to be able to find good. Now, where do they find good? Well, I think in surrounding the middle, they find good in God, right? We saw that. Chesed and Rachamim. They find good in God. But what do we have at the middle of the middle of the middle? God is not there. God's not at the middle of the middle of the middle. You know who's there? The Gever. And you know what we find in there? Tov la Gever. See, this I think is really extraordinary. Remember I said before that generally speaking, when you have this this kind of alphabetic acrostic that is, this triple alphabetic acrostic, what we find is that there's variation in the use of the words in the letter, right? I said that very unclearly, but I hope you understood what I meant, right? So that if you have Aleph, 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 each one uses a different word, right? Each verse starts with a different word, but that's not true with our tet words. All three sentences that begin with the letter tet have the word tov. This is true also in kaf, but other than that, it's not true in any other letter. Tov, tov, tov. That's what we have there at the middle of the book. Who would have thought, if I would have asked you at the beginning of the class, what word are you going to find at the middle of Eikha, in the heart of Eikha? I think even if I'd given you a very easy choice, tov or ra, I think many people would have expected to find bad, not good, ra, not tov. But when we get to the center of the book, all that's left is the Gever, who is pared down to his inner essence. And what he finds at his inner essence is Tov la Gever. What is that Tov? The Megillah doesn't tell us. It's surrounded by God. It's almost kind of enveloped by God's chesed, by God's rachamim, by the person's belief in God's loyalty and kindness and compassion. But in the middle, the Gever finds himself. And in doing so, he finds that he can find good, even in a world, in a turbulent world, even when storm clouds surround him. And if you look at this other word that I think that is very significant, that I highlighted here, right here in the middle, Yeshev badad v'yidom ki natal alav. He shall sit alone and in silence when things are placed on him, when he goes through difficulties. It is good to introspect. It is good to embrace this kind of depth experience. That word badad, many of you are already thinking, that's a word we've seen before. It actually appears only twice in the entire Megillah, thereby I think even more so drawing our attention, once in the opening verse and once in the middle of the middle of the middle. The opening verse is a terrible story, a tragic portrait of a city which is sitting alone, which is like a widow, which has been emptied of its inhabitants. It's a negative and terrible, catastrophic and tragic portrait. And in the middle, we're told, embrace it. Grab that aloneness, grab that experience, and use it to create a purposeful and good life. And that, I think, is what we have here in the center of the theology of Eikha. And so Eikha's overall structure mirrors a whirlwind, some kind of turbulent storm. The book's design, I think, really represents the shape of the theology that is kind of swirling around the nation which is suffering. We have these two parallel rings which encircle the Gever, which encircle the middle chapter, and they represent, I think, a kind of a tangled fluctuation between theodicy and outrage, between Siduk Hadin, between justifying God and finding our simple faith in God, and outrage at God, Sadik Viralo, sense that bad things happen to good people. And this represents, I think, the rather complex fluctuation of the way the religious human or the religious nation is meant to deal with difficult things. But of course, the middle of the book represents the kind of placid eye of the storm. It may be engulfed by suffering and misery around it, but the center is calm. And it teaches us that human beings have the resources and the ability to dig deep into ourselves and find that resilience and that ability, not just to combat the hostile forces that surround us, but also really to find the good in them. This, I think, really is a magnificent portrait of the theological experience, the way that Eikha is presenting it. And it demonstrates one of the things that I really love about the Tanakh is that the Tanakh has tremendous faith in human beings, in our majesty. And I think that this book, even in the midst of some very difficult times, which oftentimes, also involve a kind of a loss of dignity, this book is reminding human beings of the deep resources that exist at our core. And I will conclude with one final point. Well, so here we have just the overall description, the whole description, the whole structure here. I brought for you a couple more descriptions of the structure. But the final point that I want to make is that Eikha, I mentioned, it opens with the word ani, right? It opens with this kind of very self-centered perspective or experience of this giver. Again, when I say narcissistic, I actually don't mean it as a criticism per se. I think that suffering oftentimes does create the need to turn inward and to look for the ani. But as the chapter progresses, this Gever uses his newfound lessons in having discovered the I to find once again, not just his place among the people, but also leadership among the people. He, in that third section of chapter 3, which we didn't get to, he really is able to use his experience to help others. And the chapter actually ends not with the word ani, but with the word Hashem. And so this chapter moves us from a person who is kind of self-centeredly looking inward. When he describes even his prayer, he never really finds the thou in his prayer. He says, Gam ki ezak va'ashavea satam tefilati. Even when I cry out and I plead, my prayer is blocked. He never even mentions God, but by the end of the chapter, he has found God. He has found his community. He has found his nation. He has found his fellow humans. All of this through using the experience of suffering to draw from the depths of his of his persona and build his character and build his relationship with God. And so this is the theology of Eikha in under an hour. I think that one could also spend a little bit more time on it. I'll just conclude with a tefillah for Bisorot Tovot, for Achdut, for the full rebuilding of Yerushalayim. And thank you very much for your attention. Oh, I see that I...
Thank you.
Cats.
Dr. Yael, thank you very much. Really very, very powerful, very moving. Thank you. And besides the wonderful content, I need you to give me a lesson on how to use PowerPoint. Wow. That is something else. I mean, I know there's some good people, but I really am like, I'm too old for this stuff, you know. But that was, like ins and the outs. So Yeshiko, that's just an aside. That's just added. But it's good.
That's a Corona. That's a Corona game.
It's a Corona gig. I got you. That was really powerful. Okay, Yeshiko, thank you. Go back. It's already late in Israel. You're go have dessert if you missed it before. Enjoy, and thank you. We look forward to learning with you again in the future. Thank you, and should have Nacham and all good things. Okay.